When you watch The Eminence and Shadow from Sid's perspective, you're watching a goofy comedy about a guy pretending to be the mastermind behind everything. Sid's entire world is just a game. Every over-the-top speech and every impossible coincidence is just another chance for him to live out his fantasy. But that's only because we're seeing the world through Sid's overpowered POV. Outside his perspective, The Eminence and Shadow is a much darker story. From possession to drugging to inhumane experiments, the consequences of this world are as real as they sound. While Sid thinks he's playing pretend, everyone else is living through a dark reality, but that doesn't stop him from changing things. Okay, so starting off, we have to understand the stakes, what possession actually is and how it's viewed in this world. So possession is a disease where someone's magic power goes completely out of control, causing their body to literally rot and mutate from the inside. It usually starts off with a small fever and minor pain, then eventually becomes black bruises all over. Then it starts mutating the flesh until the victim is a mindless, grotesque mass of rotting flesh. Now this disease only targets young girls who are descendants of the three heroes: Freya the human, Olivier the elf, and Lily the therianthrope. Humans getting possession is exceedingly rare though because they have much shorter lifespans compared to elves or therianthropes. Anyway, the disease comes from the heroes who were injected with the Diablos' cells in order to defeat the demon, which meant all of their future descendants would have these cells passed down. The only difference is their bodies can't adapt to them in the same way. The church later on spun the story that Diablos placed a curse on the three heroes to fearmonger the people into thinking it's a demonic curse that must be eradicated. But in reality, it's just magical overload. The latent Diablo cells are too powerful for a little kid to handle, so the demonic mana just tears their cells apart from the inside. But being possessed in and of itself isn't the worst part, because once you're possessed, you're as good as dead to everyone you know. Victims of possession are ostracized from their communities because possession is seen as a demonic curse, rather than proof of a heroic bloodline, which we can thank the church for. This means that there's no support for victims of possession anywhere. Once people find out, you're essentially a monster to get rid of. That's why Shadowgarden started growing so quickly. The rescued victims have no home to go back to. From the moment they're possessed, it's a death sentence. Possession is incurable, so even the families of the possessed can't do anything about it. It happens randomly, it could happen to literally anyone, and once it starts, you really can't stop it. The thing with possession is that the world was designed to make sure these victims had nowhere to go, and the people responsible aren't exactly lurking in the shadows. They're the ones everyone trusts in broad daylight. I mentioned the church a few times now, but it's not really the church that's doing this, it's the cult, using the church's name and influence for their own agenda. The main religion in this world is called the Divine Teachings, where they worship the goddess Beatrix, and not the burger-munching elf. Way before, back in the day, the cult set up this church and established all this fake lore to keep the masses blind and to conceal the truth about everything relating to Diablos, and demanded that if any village had any possessed, they have to turn in the girl to the church for reasons that they wouldn't disclose. Naturally, people wouldn't want to question the church, so they comply, and anyone who doesn't is labeled a heretic to be murdered. They do this to gather live test subjects for experimentation. Now, with an organization this massive, most of the church's grunts, called Templars, aren't exactly in the know about their cult origins, and neither is their head priestess, Victoria. Now, she's an interesting character because, unlike the other characters we see that are victims of possession, she was the one perpetrating this stuff. Pre-time skip, she was a prominent figure of the church, being a head priestess and all. But behind the scenes, she was the one commanding the church's Templars to go down to villages and capture possessed. She thought she was doing the right thing because she kept hearing the so-called goddess's voice in her head commanding her to do so. So she moved thinking she was enacting God's will or something. Ironically enough though, later she also gets possessed and has this whole identity crisis, questioning everything she's done up until that point. Anyway, it's later revealed that the cult drugged her, which explains the whole goddess's will in her head thing. And they were simply using her like a pawn to gather test subjects. After realizing she was not enacting God's will and doing some pretty messed up shit, she believed she was beyond redemption, and so did some members of Shadowgarden. I mean, she's the reason a lot of possessed were kidnapped from their families and subjected to inhumane experiments. So her joining Shadowgarden was more like a spit in the face to their victims. But before anything is decided, Sid comes out of nowhere when her symptoms start getting worse, and cures her, right before saving her from a monster. Having been abandoned by the goddess Beatrix, she saw Shadow as a true living god. Shadowgarden takes this as Sid telling them to accept her into the fold and become a new member of Shadowgarden. So they assign her the number 559, and she becomes Zeta's direct subordinate. This is more than just a story of someone who was fooled by the cult. It's an example of how the cult turns ordinary people into weapons. Or pawns, I guess. But there is another character who has a similar fate to being used by the cult, and it's Geddon, or Gitan. He's another example of someone who did terrible things out of desperation, all because of the cult's overwhelming power, preying on his weakness. Back in the day, he was a young warrior, a part of the Great Wolves clan, who saved Yukime once, on the battlefield. They later fell in love and were said to be married to unite their tribes, the Great Wolves and the Spirit Foxes. But there were some regional conflicts going on with their local god dying or something, and with a potential war closing in and being hopelessly powerless, Agitan was feeling the pressure. So he accepts a deal from the cult out of desperation, which ends up backfiring because he loses all reason and kills Yukime's mother, and almost kills her too. The only reason he didn't go on a full rampage is because stylish bandit slayer was there to save the day conveniently. And as Geddon put it, Sid took the light from his eyes that day. Anyway, this sets up Yukime's whole revenge motivation to kill Gitan with her own hands for what he did. Despite both of them being on opposite sides though, they still hold on to their wedding gifts to each other. I'm not actually sure what these are, but I'm just gonna call them that. Now I'd like to believe it's because they wish things didn't have to be this way. But now that they're against each other, there's nothing to be done. I mean, in Gitan's dying breath, he tells Sid to take care of Yukime. It showed how somewhere deep down he still cared. The example of someone doing the wrong things for the right reasons. He laments how in the past, if he just had more power, he could have saved everyone. But in the end, he was used by the cult and then disposed of. And that's what makes Gitan's story so tragic. He wasn't born evil. I mean, he was literally fighting to protect his tribe like anyone else. Victoria and Geddon were both exploited by the cult, but they didn't meet the same fate in the end. Victoria luckily got a second chance through Shadow Garden, while Gitan gave a final request to Sid before dying. That's the difference between being used by the cult and being ended by it. But exploiting desperate people was only the beginning. The real horror of the cult is what happens when they get their hands on someone who's actually possessed. I've mentioned how the cult kidnaps victims of possession to run experiments on, but what does that actually entail? Well, being a part of the cult of Diablos, they're after just one thing. Diablos' power. Possession stems from the demonic cells passed down from the three heroes' bloodline. Naturally, there's some residual demonic power left over, and the cult uses the victims of possession to harvest that power. They use it to create the balls of Diablos. Yeah, no, I'm just kidding. They're called the beads of Diablos. They grant the consumer immense magic power and stop their aging for a year. So it's like some pseudo-immortality plus a big power boost. They also use some victims as living energy sources for cloning and other research facilities. The goal is to tame Diablos' power and use it to take over the world. Which, to be honest, they've already done. They're just being greedy now. Now, the anime doesn't fully let you take in the horrors of possession because we're following Sid, but a bunch of characters are pretty fleshed out with their whole possession backstory. First up, we have Epsilon, the character we're all pretty familiar with. Now, her backstory goes like this. She used to be a part of elven nobility, and she was praised for her natural beauty, high intellect, and her talent with the arts, which also explains her public persona. But all of that came crashing down the moment she became possessed. It caused her family and close friends to completely abandon her and even hunt her down, out of fear and betrayal. Later on though, while she was climbing a mountain to get away, while her symptoms were getting worse, Sid finds and saves her. After that, she pledges her eternal loyalty to him. Now her story shows how even the title of nobility doesn't spare you from this fate. Epsilon was saved in the end, but not every possessed gets that lucky. Next up, we have a more tragic story that doesn't end with a happy ending. We have Milia. Now she's interesting because she's the first real possessed we see outside of Shadow Garden. Back in episode 2, Shadow Garden faces off against this guy named Viscount Grease, who offhandedly mentions how he joined up with the cult because they promised they'd do something about his daughter's possession. But we know he gets killed in that fight. Flash forward a few years later, and we see his daughter Milia, the same daughter the cult promised to save, being used for experiments, to the point where she's mutated beyond what's normal and is pretty much a monster now. Even Shadow Garden couldn't save her now. That's why Alpha puts her to rest, lamenting how they couldn't save her. But yeah, it didn't end there for her. Now this is more light novel territory, so be warned, but we later find out the cult took her corpse and used Diablos' power to revive her, and then they turn into a brainless living weapon meant to fight against the Shadow Garden. When she's locked in a fight with Shadow later on, Sid instantly clocks that this isn't a monster he's fighting, and rather than killing her, he shoots out a beam of magic that instantly reverses her mutation, and then restores her body to its original state, turning her back into a human. He then lets Alpha take care of the rest as usual, and she joins up with Shadow Garden, becoming number 711. After being a test subject for years, she obviously had some issues after that. It became hard for her to open up to other members of Shadow Garden, showing just how being rescued wasn't enough to undo the years of damage that was done to her psyche. This is why the world is so much darker than it looks, because the cruelty doesn't stop at death. That's just how it is. For everyone else, possession is a curse with no solution, a fate that can't be avoided. But then, Sid Kagano enters the picture. With all this messed up shit, you'd hope that there's light at the end of the tunnel. And there definitely is. Although Sid is a LARPing goofball, he still manages to do good. Every time he comes across a possessed, he heals on no questions asked, just because he can. What they do after is up to them and Shadow Garden. That's also why he's so revered in Shadow Garden, because he breaks their perception of the world itself by doing the impossible. The cult has its roots everywhere, like they pretty much have control of the entire world. Standing up to them is practically unheard of because no one can take them on. Curing possession has always been impossible, and yet Sid casually does the impossible. Whether he realizes it or not, every person he saves is someone who would have been trapped in an otherwise pretty messed up, horrible fate. That's why he's able to create such a massive organization of girls that pretty much worship the ground he walks on. But then Sid isn't the only one capable of all this. Out of the 7 shadows, Alpha and Epsilon are also the only other people who can cure possession, based on what Sid taught them. They aren't nearly as efficient, but they can still achieve the same result. That's how Shadow Garden grew during the time skip without Sid. Even without him being there, they're still facing off against the cult. There's also a reason why Shadow Garden's members are so strong, and it's ironically because of possession. Now, I didn't mention this earlier, but possession is just demon cells that corrupt magic circuits from the inside, meaning it's a magical overload. So when their clogged magic circuits are cleared, their ability to channel magic through them is way more efficient, making them much stronger than your average Dark Knight or cult foot soldier. On top of that, the massive base of operations in Alexandria makes the perfect home for them. They can train to be better fighters against the cult, or they can work at Mitsugoshi for a more peaceful life. That's why Shadow Garden is so different from any other organization fighting the cult. In fact, they might actually be the only people fighting the cult. They're a group of people who are given a second chance after being victims. Sid never really set out to save the world, and he probably doesn't even realize the impact he's had on everyone. But every person he cured and every person who found a home in Shadow Garden exists because of him. All this just goes to show how dark the world really is. I don't hate the fact that the anime doesn't focus on all of this, but it does make the world feel a little one-dimensional at times, when there isn't really any stakes. I think a strong point of the show is the contrast between the humor and the more serious moments. It keeps a balance where you can watch a show casually for shits and giggles, but if you want to look deeper into it, it's all there if you want to pay attention to it. Now, I've read the next few volumes of the light novels, and the next few arcs have the potential to take a darker approach. More so than the last few seasons. But I doubt they'll let things get too dark because it might ruin the appeal for the comedy aspect of the show. Anyway, thanks for watching and subscribe if you liked the video.